Good afternoon. And today, what we want to talk about in particular is a second look at the role of developing countries in the broader debate over the issues of climate change. In the first round, as we talked about the Kyoto protocols, the focus was certainly on the role of developing nations, but two things have happened in the meantime that have really sharpened those questions very much. The first is a growing sense of the importance of developing nations in a broader global strategy of climate change. There's had some effort to try to deal with not only China and India, but also with countries like Brazil. We've had some effort to try to deal with the sources and the causes of climate change, but also the impacts of climate change at the same time on some smaller countries, including countries that have subsistence agriculture and other places that would be disproportionately affected by changes in climate, that we need to do something about that. So the importance of developing countries in the entire debate have become much more sharp. The other thing that's happened is a much more intense focus at the same time on the fact that we now have an economy that's not growing as quickly, and a concern about what we're going to do about trying to deal with these problems that have become increasingly important, dealing with developing countries at a time when there's less money to figure out and to spend on dealing with them. So this dilemma has become ever sharper. Dilemma on the one side of trying to figure out how to deal with an issue that's of rising importance, at the same time the resources needed to try to deal with those problems, in fact, become ever more difficult because there's less money to do something about them. So that's our challenge to try to figure out today, a problem of trying to figure out how to try to get at those questions, a puzzle of trying to figure out how we deal with the policy challenges that developing countries pose and the necessity of trying to find the resources for dealing with something about that. So to get at that, there are a couple things that I want to try to explore in particular. Not only the pathway to Copenhagen, but the challenges that lie behind that. Those are the two things that we want to explore today. As we look at these, there are a series of discussions already underway which are very, very interesting. One of which has to do with discussions that have already helped to try to frame some of the discussions and some of the debates that will be happening in Copenhagen. Discussions have already happened in Bali with a set of preliminary agreements that have already been framed. And I have some information to share with that, and there's information there at the bottom as well. But there's already substantial agreements that have already been reached, as well as some questions that are open for continued debate. Then a second stage of things going on actually as we talk in Bonn, as climate representatives are meeting and discussing and exploring what to do about those things. There's a short conversation here by the United Nations Climate Change Convention leader, Secretary Vio de Boer, and let me try to pull that up if I can. This will take just a moment here as I get this up. I may have to do this the hard way. So give me just a moment if I can to try to.
Just referred to Copenhagen being 8 months away. Actually, Copenhagen is only 6 weeks away, because that's all the agreed negotiating time that we have left between now and Copenhagen. 3 sessions of 2 weeks makes 6 weeks. So that means that we have 6 weeks left to deliver on a huge ambition which was proclaimed in Bali a year ago, namely a long-term response to climate change, a meaningful long-term response to climate change. And that agreement in Copenhagen, to my mind, needs to deliver clarity on at least 4 things. First of all, it needs to deliver clarity on what industrialized countries will do individually through targets to reduce their emissions. Secondly, it needs to deliver clarity on what major developing countries will do to limit the growth of their emissions. Because without action also on the part of developing countries, we simply cannot solve this problem. But that takes me to the third point, finance. It is not reasonable to expect developing countries whose primary concern is economic growth and poverty eradication to act on this issue without financial support. Financial support for adaptation, financial support for mitigation, and financial support to deliver technology. So the third essential in Copenhagen is finance. And the fourth essential is governance. In order to manage the resources that will be available for adaptation and mitigation, we need a governance structure that gives an equal voice to developing countries, that puts developing countries in a position to ensure that the resources that are available for their clean growth and for their adaptation are used in the way that they want. So those for me are the 4 essentials of Copenhagen that we are working towards. In the first real negotiating session of the year, we have several documents on the table that go to the point of future commitments, targets of industrialized countries. Mr. Zamit Kutaya has prepared 2 much broader documents as a basis for negotiations under the Convention. All of those documents will be discussed here over the coming days. In the context of the Bali Roadmap process under the Convention, the goal is to help Mr. Zamit Kutaya make the next step, which will be to have a fully fledged negotiating text on the table by June. So a lot of work to get done here over the coming week. Thank you.
Now, this was a session that was held, as you can see, back on March 29th, just last Sunday. And so it represents the framing of these issues as we've gone and the puzzle of trying to figure out what it is that has to be dealt with, where it is that we're going, and how to try to go about getting there.
Accessible?
They're accessible. Here's a copy here, in fact, and it's available on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's the UNFCCC that is listed on there, and it's available there. It's available there on that link that's on the page. It'll be available on the class website, and for those of you here in the room, I'll just leave a copy of this behind. There are papers here that are really in 2 parts. One is a set of things that are more or less agreed to, and then a second document that talks about some of the big issues that are in outline form that need to be filled in. There are some very big things that have already been advanced, including a very aggressive effort to try to meet more stringent climate improvement and greenhouse gas reduction targets. But the other piece of it is to recognize that there are some very large challenges that lie ahead as well. And those are summarized in this. So this essentially is a state of knowledge of where the negotiations are so far, an effort to try to determine both where it is that they have agreed, and everyone has agreed to go, and the outstanding problems that need yet to be resolved. And so those are the things there. The documents are available and accessible through that link there at the bottom. And as you go down, there's a focus document, as it's called, partway down. And there are 2 different ones that are available for clicking, in their PDFs and easy to get at. But this is the video that you saw is just from the conversation that was held just last Sunday. So there's a material there, and there's a set of issues here that need to be explored. Those issues are essentially 4 things, as the General Chair discussed, 4 basic issues. The first of which is the set of issues for industrialized countries. The puzzle here is how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. For developing countries, by contrast, the focus is on limiting the growth of their emissions. So notice there's a subtle difference between the 2. For developed countries, the target is to try to bring down the total amount of emissions. The role for developing countries is not to bring the amount down, but simply to limit the growth at which emissions are being produced. So it gives developing countries a little bit more elbow room in reaching these targets, but it also recognizes that there are substantial challenges on both fronts. But one of the fundamental differences in the goals of climate change policy is this fundamental, subtle, but fundamental difference between the 2. On the one hand, reducing the amount of emissions from developed countries. On the other hand, reducing the rate of growth of emissions for developing countries. But that, of course, as we recognize, isn't enough. There's the question of finance, which is the fact that developing countries cannot be expected to act on this issue without financial support. It's a recognition of the fact that it's expensive and that the amount of resources that are going to be required are in excess of what developing countries can on their own be likely to produce. That is, if we really believe that this is a global problem that's going to require a global solution, it's going to require a global investment by developed countries in the efforts by developing countries to meet these targets. That it's impossible to believe and to imagine or to predict or project that developing countries are going to be able to reduce the amount of emissions without help. And the help not only has to be finance, but also in technological support. And finally, there's a governance question as well, which is that we need to figure out how we're going to make this work. What kind of governance structure are we going to create? And in particular, we need a governance structure that gives an equal voice to developing countries and how resources available for mitigation and adaptation are used. And these are all phrases that are taken from these official documents. So as we walk through these things, it anticipates a couple of things to highlight on the role of developing countries. First, that the kind of targets that they meet need to be substantial, but have to be different from those of developed countries. So it's recognizing the imperative economic growth and development there. Secondly, it's a focus on understanding that their own resources are not going to be enough to be able to meet these targets, and it's going to require financial support from developed countries. And then finally, there needs to be a governance system in which developing countries have a seat at the table and have a voice in being able to figure out how to make those investments for both mitigation and adaptation. So these are, on first reading, so, yeah, okay, I understand this, I get this. These are very important, often subtle, but very important points that have to do with the nature of the targets, the nature of the financing, and the nature of the decision-making process that underlies all the efforts to try to deal with the climate change strategies and policies that will be underway in Copenhagen. One of the things that, especially here in the United States so often, is as we begin to talk about the questions of climate change and policy development, there's a sense of we've got to find a way to get on board. We've got to get the United States on board. We've got to find a way to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we produce. But what this is also a very clear recognition, kind of a stark argument, that that alone can't be enough. That if we're truly serious about a climate change policy that's going to work, we need to recognize that developed countries, including the United States, if this is going to work according to the UN document, will have to take an important leadership role in trying to transform the policies affecting developing countries as well. So the three issues that we need to look at in particular: adaptation and mitigation, and then other needed changes that are going to be required. Three things in particular. Adaptation first. One of the things, as we've talked before in the course of our discussions in this course, is that one of the major pieces that has changed since Kyoto is a sense that the pace of climate change has increased at a faster rate than was anticipated in Kyoto, that the consequences for the environment are proceeding more rapidly than was anticipated back in Kyoto, that the idea of being able to make changes fast enough now to prevent further environmental consequences from occurring are pretty small. And so therefore, we're going to have to not only deal with the effort to try to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases we produce, and therefore the amount of climate change we're going to produce in the future, but how to deal inevitably with the fact that we already perhaps have waited too long, and that some of those consequences will begin to evidence themselves before we have a chance to prevent them from happening. That is, we have to deal with adaptation to the problems in addition to trying to reduce the rate at which we produce new ones. That importance of adaptation, this kind of abstract, maybe even antiseptic word for dealing with the fact that we must, according to these arguments, deal with the inevitable consequences of climate change already underway, is an important part of what's going on. Connected with that as well is an argument that for developing countries in particular, it can be a very heavy burden, because to tell developing countries that, well, now you've got the job of trying to find ways of dealing with consequences that you had no role in creating is an important question that deals not only with the politics but also the equity of this policy issue as well. And we've dealt with some of those questions earlier in the course. To be able to deal with issues of adaptation, that is, how we're going to help everybody, developed and developing countries alike, deal with these consequences, is going to require both financial and technological support. For developing countries in particular, it's not only how do they encourage their economies to grow, to create jobs for their own citizens, how do they try to do so in a way that reduces the rate of growth of their own emissions, but how in the process can their own economic circumstances be improved, their own consequences be managed in a way that the costs of dealing with climate change are not borne disproportionately. So all of these have to do with the issues of adaptation, and which inevitably deal with questions of both technological and financial support for developing countries. How to help developing countries be able to deal with these consequences that are now taking place. Strategies that have been suggested, and this comes out of the UN documents themselves, first of which is a phrase that has begun to emerge, climate resilient development. There's a lot of artful language in these documents. Not only is adaptation itself a kind of term of art which captures all kinds of very complex issues, but there's also the the notion of climate resilient development. First of all, it suggests that we need to have continued economic development to be able to create the jobs. Secondly, we need to develop strategies for development that helps to both mitigate and adapt to these consequences, but also that what we need are strategies that are climate resilient, that is, where we're not betting on development of economies that will be disproportionately affected by climate changes we think are likely to happen. That is, how can we help the economies, especially of developing countries, build their economies in a way that as the consequences of climate change occur, that their economic growth is not going to be stunted. So it's an important question here about how to try to help developing countries not only grow, but grow in ways that are smart, in ways that will anticipate and to be able to steer around or deal with the consequences of that kind of development. In addition to that, there's also the point about figuring out how climate-related risks that inevitably will occur are things that developing economies can be insulated against. And so, in the context of the discussions already underway both in Bali and in Bonn are fundamental questions about how to try to deal in an equitable and efficient way with the consequences that developing countries will be facing. That's the question of adaptation. The next question is on mitigation. And as the debates on mitigation occur, these issues have come up. First, the need for financial and technological support for developing countries. A lot of the issues dealing with climate change are issues that are going to require help in more substantial, more cutting-edge technologies to help countries deal with these consequences. It's going to require efforts with economies, with technologies that, to do all of what we said before, are going to require some cutting-edge work that may lie beyond the technological capacity of some developing countries. And so there has to be some information and technology sharing that happens between developed and developing countries. Not only is it going to require money, in short, but it's going to require some transfer of technology. It's going to require an active and aggressive strategy to make that happen. There's going to be a need to try to have a measurement, reporting, and verification process such that as we establish targets, maybe if we have cap and trade and other kinds of mitigation strategies, that we can at least keep track of what we're doing. And it's not only going to be something that developed countries have to rely on, but something that developing countries are going to need technical as well as administrative help to try to make happen. There's going to have to be scorekeeping, and developing countries are going to need help in making sure that the scoreboard is something that they can operate and manage as well as the developed countries can. And then finally, there's increasing focus on what people are calling now NAMAs, Nationally Appropriate Mitigation Actions. You can't have a big committee without creating all kinds of acronyms. And one of the rules about creating acronyms is to make sure they're pronounceable. So this is a NAMA. But when people start throwing this around, what they're really talking about, again, another interesting term of art, nationally appropriate mitigation actions. What this really means is that we can't have a one-size-fits-all climate change strategy. That if you have an economy, a developing country, that is focused heavily on the use of natural resources to try to grow the economy, like cutting down trees to supply lumber, where the lumber creates jobs and the jobs create economic growth, you can't all of a sudden say unilaterally no more cutting down trees, because at that point you destroy the economy. And so the question is, how can you devise a strategy that helps to mitigate climate change strategies without destroying the country's economy in the process? Put differently, how can you try to encourage a national economy to grow in a way that's consistent with a strategy that will reduce the amount of greenhouse gases and therefore climate change that will occur? And the notion here is that if you have some economies that are focused on agriculture, some economies that are focused on forestry, some economies that are focused on industrial production, some economies that are focused on the extraction of raw materials like coal, that you figure out a strategy that works and is appropriate for the national economy, but which at the same time helps you achieve the strategy and the goals that you're interested in climate change. So that not only is there much more focus on the needs of developing countries, not only is there much more focus on the need for focus on adaptation, not only is there an explicit focus on the need for mitigation, but there's also a recognition of the fact that the mitigation strategies will have to vary substantially from country to country depending on the nature of that country's economy and the opportunities for economic growth. That is, this is an effort that's designed to grow economies, not stand in the way of production, but do so in a way that at the same time is conscious of the different sources of economic growth. A side point, as you listen to all these conversations and discussions, as you both watch and attempt to participate in these issues, much more than was the case, I think, in Kyoto, is an explicit recognition of the role of the private economy and the need for economic growth and job creation in the process. This is in part a reflection of the fact that everybody knows that the economy in most parts of the world is not what it was back at the time when Kyoto was in place. There was much more of a discussion then about an expectation of continued economic growth that would make some of these decisions easier because it would generate new revenues in the process. But as the economy gets tighter, as the ability to be able to come up with more money gets harder, then there's this expectation that we need to be conscious of the need not to kill jobs as we're trying to deal with issues of climate change. This, in many ways, if you think about it, reflects some of the changes that have happened fundamentally in the United States as well. On the one hand, a rejection at national policy levels in the United States of Kyoto on grounds that it would go too far in restricting the ability of our national economy here to adapt to changes in the future, and that in fact it would stand in the way of economic growth. So the idea of harnessing climate change policy to economic growth and using strategies to promote economic growth to shape climate change policy is something that's a fundamental change from what had happened back in Kyoto. Something that fundamentally can help drive the founders and the organizers' hope a different kind of approach this time around. The next generation of climate change policy, in short, is much more market-oriented, market-driven, market-focused, but with an effort to try to speed up the rate of climate change policy improvement in a way that doesn't at the same time get in the way of economic growth and job development. It's a very important difference from what had happened the time before. But there's a sense as well about changes that are needed in the process. Changes that are needed in terms of, go through the catalog first, more financial support. For developing countries in particular, there's a sense that this is not going to be easy, it's not going to be cheap, and for developing countries to be able to accomplish these goals, there has to be financial support from developed countries. So one important question is, how much money is going to be on the table, where's it going to come from, and how's it going to flow? Who is going to get it? There's a need and expectation for more financial support. The second thing is a focus on more technological assistance. That not only is money going to be needed, but some of this investment has got to be smart and developed in the process of trying to find ways of creating new and better jobs and new and better technologies that are going to make it possible for country-specific policies to be designed. The third is the need for strategies for governance arrangements. If there's going to be exchanges of money and technology, how's this going to work? Is it going to be voluntary? Is it going to happen through the UN? Is it going to happen through regional associations? Is it going to happen with, well, we hope it's going to work with crossed fingers, or is there going to be a conscious institutional strategy for dealing with this? And it's one of the questions that, quite frankly, as these documents already make clear, when we think about the governance issues, those things have not really been addressed for a couple of reasons. First is that the United States is a relatively late convert to this whole strategy and is a major player. Now, it's been enough to try to figure out how to recapture and refocus its strategy, and we haven't quite gotten yet to the question of just trying to figure out how to change the governance arrangements. In part, the question of exactly how to share money, how to share power, how to share technology is much harder because it gets from the broad, yes, oh, of course we're in favor of this, to the exactly how this is going to happen process, which is going to make it much harder to try to drive it. Beyond that is the need also for governance arrangements in general having to do with cooperative research and development. To be able to make this work, I mean, quite frankly, it's going to require a need for understanding, if we're going to move beyond one size fits all, to a real understanding of how agriculturally based economies are different from subsistence economies, which are different from extraction-based economies, which are different from industrial-based economies. It's one thing to say that, and of course we know that that's true, but think about what kind of climate change improvements are going to be possible and necessary. It's going to be something that's going to require some very sophisticated efforts to try to figure out what kind of conversations we have, which scientists are going to talk to whom, how's the technology going to be transferred, and how are the right kind of strategies going to be designed in different kinds of countries and places. There's also the question of intellectual property rights. If we're talking about transfer of technology, sharing of technology, there's ultimately the question of who ultimately owns it. And given the fact that a lot of what we're talking about in climate change is stuff that sits right on the cutting edge of technology, it's one thing to say we need to develop new technologies, new battery life, new strategies for wind and solar. We need to have new efforts to try to figure out how to make coal burn cleaner and how to try to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. And everybody says, oh, yes, that's right. And we need new technology, new investment, new development on that. But once you figure out, for example, whoever figures out the best strategy for extending battery life is not going to want to give it away to the world for free. But if it turns out that the efforts to try to adapt and mitigate climate change questions requires the investment in these new technologies, and the technologies have to be shared, how do you make sure that the process of sharing the technology doesn't result in a loss of ownership of the intellectual property rights for the people who produce it? Because the concern is if you can't expect any return for the intellectual property you develop, there won't be much incentive for developing it to begin with. It's a concern already in the movie business with DVDs. It's a concern in the music business as well with CDs. It's a concern that if you develop stuff, what's to prevent people from stealing it? So there's a grave concern on the part of a lot of people that we need as much technological development as we can get, so we need to have as many incentives as we can for developing it. We need to share that technology so that everybody can catch up. We need to share it in a way that makes sure that the incentives for producing it aren't destroyed in the process. So it's a pretty substantial challenge of governance that lies at the core. And the simple fact is we don't really have an international system of governance for dealing with these questions yet. So as you read these documents, one of the things that comes through pretty clearly is the fact that there are some pretty substantial, large, open questions that are these are issues we need to think about and deal with that lurk behind the fundamental and broad policy initiatives and goals that we want to try to accomplish. Then there's a question about, finally, how we're going to make these things work. When I talk about delivery strategies, what I really mean is just how are we going to go about the process of packaging this stuff and sharing it, packaging this and getting it around. And so one question is, the traditional approach to development policy, and this especially deals with developing countries here, of course, the traditional approach to development policy is to operate project by project. We're going to build a dam. We're going to help build a road. We're going to develop a hydroelectric project in your community. We're going to come and help you develop sustainable agriculture. Most of what development policy has consisted of for a very long time is project by project by project by project. The new kinds of approaches to climate change policy are much more systemic. They're much more focused on the economy as a whole, the region as a whole, regional disparities. Not that there still won't be room for project by project approaches, but there's much more focus on an effort to try to deal with larger scale, systemic kinds of solutions that go beyond a project by project by project approach. Because project by project approaches, it's argued, have two problems. One is that if you bring in a hydroelectric plant, you may not be systemically connecting to the rest of the economy of the area. And the other is if what you do is hydroelectric, there may be places where hydroelectric plants are not appropriate and where other strategies are needed. So if you think hydropower, you think solar, you think wind, not that we may not need all of them, but the more that you focus in a tunnel vision, the less you'll be able to do the country-specific, country-appropriate development projects that is increasingly the focus of the way in which this is going. So it's a dilemma. On the one hand, yes, we want something that's country-specific, but the more country-specific that we are, the more we need to move away from project-based thinking. So one of the things that is subtly woven into all these kinds of questions is a fundamental question of how you go about packaging this, what kind of conversations you have. And the more you move away from project-based approaches to things that are more program or sectoral, program which is more, in terms of larger geographic areas, sector, public-private, nonprofit, how you try to think about systemic-based changes as opposed to project-based changes is an important piece of this. Second thing has to do with the tools that you use. a joke here in the United States is, well, we're the government, we're here to help, that we're here, we're going to give you money. We give you money, the problem will be solved. But is the most appropriate way of working in terms of grants or loans? Of course, everybody would like to have money without having to worry about paying it back. Paying it back provides more resources for doing things later. What is it that's going to create the right incentives? There's some of those who say that what really you need is fundamental changes in private sector behavior, which have to do with changes in incentives within which private sector companies operate. But what's the appropriate focus among those different kinds of strategies? It's one thing to say, yes, 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 we want to try to reduce the amount of climate change, we want to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases, but should you do it through selective investment in some technologies? Or should you invest in incentives that try to get private sector operators to change their behaviors? One of the fundamental questions we have to ask is what's more likely to produce the kind of changes that we want? This has to do with developing countries in particular. Next is the question of institutions. There's a choice between whether or not we try to strengthen existing institutions or whether we need to create new ones. This has to do not only about the role of governments inside developing countries, but also has fundamentally to do with the puzzles and the questions about what happens and whether or not, in fact, we need to create new institutions to try to deal with those, and maybe new institutions that are regionally based as well. Are the existing governance institutions a very good match for the problems that we have to try to solve? There is also a hierarchy of functions the UN has identified of governance, these kind of broad strategic questions, operations, how to get things working, and then technical advice, which is how to get things happening, and who does what is something that's very much open to question. And finally, there are some of the fundamental questions of governance that have to do with accountability. Are we interested in focusing on efficiency and financial control? Because anybody who gives money is going to want to make sure the money is being spent well. If there's anything that we've learned in the last few weeks, it's that the public is very unhappy about the idea of giving public cash without accountability for how it's spent. All you have to do is look at the Bank of Scotland, look at AIG, look at General Motors, look at the difficulty of trying to get more bailout money anywhere in the world going anywhere. The public is increasingly insisting on tight accountability for how that money is being spent. But at the same time, there are broader issues in cooperation and issues of ownership of ideas and ownership of production processes. Where are we going to focus on our accountability?
The money issue. I mean, where you talked a lot about the need for more financial support and the need for all these policies and adaptation, whatnot. But what about the money itself? Like, are we talking about? The reading was about the World Bank, or is that a big piece of the puzzle? Is it?
Well, and the question.
Governments around the world. Is it?
No, the big question is, where is the money going to come from? I mean, who's going to pay for this? And the World Bank can't just print money. It's got to get its money from member countries and from developed countries for transfer to developing countries. Tell me, to be blunt, is the United States going to be interested in giving money to the World Bank for transfer to developing countries for purposes of technological improvement, for adaptation and mitigation? Would the United States prefer to give the money directly? If it gives it directly, how much flexibility will there be? If there's a strategy that lies behind it, will the strategy be consistent with what the European Union is going to be doing or consistent with what the World Bank is doing? What kind of standards will there be for accountability, given the fact that nobody wants to give anybody money for anything without strict standards for accountability now? It's not only a question of where the money is going to come from and how much is going to be on the table, but who's going to control it and whether or not people are going to be all rowing in the same direction or the different policies are going in different directions. And one of the things, especially if you read these UN documents, that is fascinating is that this is largely a set of questions that are at this point unanswered. They're places to fill in as negotiations continue. There's a lot of progress that's been made in the road through Bali, through Bonn to Copenhagen on broad goals, more aggressive action, on broad strategies, on the identification of big issues, and efforts to try to figure out how to deal with it. When it gets down to the basic question of how this is going to happen, however, a lot of these big questions still remain unanswered. And the documents are fascinating because in some cases there's some very sophisticated analysis about how this ought to go. In other cases, there is the question of where's the money going to come from, who's going to give it, how's it going to flow, and how are we going to hold it accountable? I mean, your basic question is, we don't know. And
is there any possibility of creating some sort of like World Bank institution for specifically climate change? I don't know. I wrote about it in my blog as a
yeah, because I mean, you were blogging about that, and maybe we need some kind of new institution for doing it. And the answer is we could certainly do that, as a lot of the World Bank efforts so far have been based on just job development, job creation. If what we need to worry about is adaptation and mitigation strategies, we could have some separate financial strategies. Or should we try to change the World Bank's focus in a way to make the job development process that's part of the World Bank's operations more green? Should individual countries, individual regions of developed countries pursue a different kind of strategy? And the answer is we haven't decided that. And one of the big outstanding questions is, assuming that we accept that developed countries have a responsibility to developing countries for dealing with these issues, assuming that it involves both adaptation and mitigation, and assuming that it involves technological transfer and financial resources, and assuming that we've got to then figure out the governance arrangements. Okay, suppose we buy all that. Then how are you going to do it? And a lot of the detailed questions are the big pieces that lie for developing countries between now and the discussions in Copenhagen. Those are the big issues that are going to have to be resolved. So there's a whole set of things we've been talking about in terms of developed countries and climate change. When we start talking about the role of developing countries, it's clear now that developing countries have a much more central role in these discussions than was the case in Kyoto. There's a sense of at least the outline of the general issues that have to do with adaptation, mitigation, governance, finance, technological improvement. So we sort of know what the basic questions are. But the big questions that you raise, how are we going to do this, are the ones that really lie ahead of us. Because we're really talking about governance strategies for trying to figure out how to make some really tough, very hard decisions with the recognition that if we don't solve that, we're not going to be able to solve the problem. And that it could very well be that the poorest of the poor will suffer the most in the process if we don't. So there's a question of equity that lies behind this as well. So that as we look forward, in fact, to the new strategy for Copenhagen, what's really different is more aggressive action, the more aggressive targets, higher targets. And in fact, if you read this early on, there are some very explicit targets for the standards that are going to be here, including the amount of parts per million and the level of reductions that they're aiming at. Here it's explicit, and it's remarkable, given how complicated some of these questions are, that the standards already are pretty clearly enumerated here. Not that there aren't still subject to negotiation, but there's some pretty tough standards here already laid out. But that there's more focus on adaptation and mitigation in the process as well. Markets have a much more central strategy because it's clear, first, that we don't have governance arrangements for dealing with this, so we're going to have to rely on markets. It's clear that for a lot of developed countries, markets continue to be important, and we're going to have market-based strategies to deal with adaptation and mitigation in developed countries. It's clear that as we try to then move into developing countries, that they're part of the multinational economic community, so we need to work in the same kind of environment. And since we don't have governance strategies, we need to find ways of getting at those questions as well. So there's much more of a focus compared to Kyoto on market-based strategies beyond cap and trade, which were that's the central idea really in Kyoto. And then finally, much more focus as well on partnerships between developed and developing nations. Left unanswered is the question of exactly what that means, how that's going to work. Is it going to happen through the World Bank, through a new green bank of some kind that works on this globally and internationally? Is it going to happen through country-by-country standards? But there's at the very least, a recognition that without an effective strategy of partnership between developed and developing nations, that the next generation of climate change policies are inevitably not going to work, that any effective strategy trying to deal with that is going to require a collaborative partnership between the developed and developing nations. And that's one of the central themes that has already emerged very clearly in the road to Copenhagen. The plan here now is that we're going to be taking a timeout next week for each of the groups to work on their projects. We'll be returning in 2 weeks with a set of readings that we'll be distributing in the meantime that are being produced by our colleagues in Asia. We're going to be sharing some of the ideas and some of the research that they've been working on as well. So we'll distribute those readings. For now, we'll adjourn for 2 weeks to focus on the projects that we're going to be presenting in Seoul.